Good afternoon, everybody, and my name's Ron Smith from the Joint Research Centre, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. Interesting topic. We're going to be looking at geospatial technologies in general and also public participation, two areas that are not often talked about together, but you'll hear more about that in a minute. Next slide. So we're working in the European Commission's Joint Research Centre on a project called ELISE, European Location Interoperability Solutions for Government. And we're part of the ISO² programme, where ELISE deals with all the levels of the European interoperability framework, legal, organisational, semantic, and technical, and has within its scope all the stakeholders of the programme, public administrations, businesses, and important for today's presentation, citizens. Our recent work has been considering digital transformation of government, and the first webinar in the series set the scene in terms of this topic and what geospatial may have to offer. In that presentation, Therese's colleague Glenn highlighted a number of points. Firstly, OECD suggests that change can happen from a government-led to a user-driven administration, that is, one that is focused on user needs and citizens' expectations. And they have also underlined the importance of networks in this context. Secondly, for the IT consultancy company Gartner, digital systems will become ecosystem-centric. Technologies will move towards greater intelligence, particularly where users are central to digital transformation. So such issues for us, given these kind of high-level views, imply that citizens have something to say when it comes to location interoperability and digital transformation. Possibly most importantly from Glenn's work in the first study, we choose to adopt some terminology and references from Zhang et al. In 2014 as our working definition of digital transformation. Here, they suggest it involves fundamental changes in the way how public organisations are structured and operate, how public services are delivered, how policies are developed, implemented and evaluated. And again, interesting for today, as well as how citizens engage in democratic processes resulting from the introduction of technologies. So a quick word about the Knowledge Transfer Project and more particularly rapid studies themselves. For us, they're a means to dive quickly and briefly into topics to understand their status and what the pertinent issues could be to help ground our understanding of the role and perhaps peculiarities of geospatial data thinking in the digital transformation of government. In this case, activities that are both involving citizens and geospatial things together. In 2001, I was lucky enough to participate in a joint National Science Foundation, European Science Foundation workshop in Spoleto in Italy. In that workshop, we tried to set out a joint research agenda for two topics: access to geographical information, and a second one about participatory approaches using geographical information as a first attempt to understand the role geospatial data sharing between governments and with citizens was forming. Issues of data access and sharing in general have evolved very well in this time, and of course we have INSPIRE and the creation of spatial data infrastructures at different levels of government globally. Where are we today with research and practice involving citizens interacting with geospatial data and the public sector? And what could be the implications for, let's say, more organisational interoperability of, broadly speaking, geospatial technologies and public democratic participation involving public administrations, businesses and citizens? Some roles may be changing while reinforcing our European values. So I would like to introduce Professor Therese Steenbergen from the Catholic University of Leuven to let us know what she has learned from the past pertinent to today's topics, about recent examples that illustrate issues we should take into account in research and practice, what elements we may want to consider in going forward to make better use of geospatial in the digital transformation of government. Therese, please.
Thank you. Before addressing the topic, let me briefly introduce myself. My background is in geography, but I did my PhD in spatial planning, urban regional sciences at Texas A&M University. I'm currently an associate professor at the Division of Geography and Tourism at KU Leuven and managing director of saddle the Spatial Applications Division of Leuven Research and Development. So what I mostly do in my research is apply different types of spatial analysis to spatial planning issues, mobility, and tourism. Now, the link with today's topic is from my ongoing projects. I have two projects where we are dealing with citizen science as a way to get information from citizens in combination with, in one case, teledetection data, so the use of satellite imagery. There is another one where we analyzed migration flows from refugees in Europe for ESPON project. I'm also involved with the Erasmus Plus EO4Geo, looking at skill building in geoinformation, which I think is also closely related to the issue of participation and empowerment democracy. The content of the presentation, I will first briefly introduce the topic and then illustrate how I went through the literature of the past 20 years to see how the technology has changed, but more even than that, how the conceptual frameworks for analyzing enabled dynamics between governments and citizens have evolved. So I took a few case studies from the past, just to show the context, because sometimes we tend to forget that our conceptual frameworks have evolved along with the technology. Then I take some more recent evolutions, and there I chose two particular examples. One is Participatory GIS, and the other one is citizen science. And from there, by comparing those issues with the ones that we found in 2003, that brings us to the main messages and some conclusions, but also some points for discussion, which I hope will be very fruitful at the end. So, to introduce the topic, I'll first refer to the previous webinar on the role of geospatial digital transformation of government, where we saw that co-creation is one of the issues that makes the whole dynamics between government and citizen more complex, but also more interesting. And then there are issues about who is in charge then, who is in charge of transforming the government, and what is the role of the citizen in all this. And it's not just a matter of government, it's also a matter of organization, businesses, and citizen organizations. And another link that I would like to make is with the overall concept of open government and ICT-enabled public sector modernization. When we see the place of participation in open government, to the open process, to the open service, but what I mostly think is important is to read what is the ultimate goal, because that's the key issue of today. Basically, there is an assumption that an open approach to government will result in better decisions and in restoring trust in public institutions. Those two issues are critical to a good democratic process and decision-making support. So these, excuse me, these are issues that we will further elaborate on. We also see that some tools have been developed to support this. One of the ISA Square tools is to help information and access information from citizens. There are some tools, but it's a question to be asked, what more tools do we need to stimulate or to improve the public participation in the decision making? So the way the study was performed was by doing a systematic review of the literature. Basically, I like to start this presentation on the literature with a monument, I think, on participation and empowerment, the trilogy of Castells. We are now in 1996, 97, 98, but the key issues there, I think, are very relevant today. Power is not just an attribute of an individual, it is a relationship. It is a relationship between individuals and between groups. So power relations are also, in the case of public participation, relations between citizen and government. Communication networks are central to implement power. So, and I think we can consider geospatial technology at this level, critical to the implementation of power making. Then one of the conclusions of Castells is that those who are programming the networks, who are switchers linking the different media, those are very strong holders of power in the network society. If we consider geospatial as one of these ways of networking, then it gives us a lot of power of influencing the participation and for influencing the power relations in society. Before I move on, so this is 96, 98, the last publication is 2012. If we look at the turn of the century, I did that through the Agile conferences, then we see that participation was an issue very much up until, well, in 2002, but afterwards, we don't really find a whole lot on public participation directly. So it looks like maybe it's no longer the concern it was around the turn of the century. But when we look at related topics, such as decision support systems, user-generated data, knowledge discovery, then we see decision support systems have been there for quite some time, but user-generated data, this knowledge discovery, are related to public participation, and these are issues that we see coming up at a later stage. So basically, I think we are looking at the same concerns, but other components. Now, how this is reflected in the literature in general. So I looked at these Agile conferences. Then I also looked at EURISA journal, because there we have the report, or two special issues on this workshop that was mentioned by Robin at the introduction in 2003. And we had a special issue on participatory GIS in 2012. I used those to make a SWOT analysis of what were the issues in the past. Then I looked at the Web of Science publications quite in general, using simple keywords as geospatial and democracy. And I found 5 useful articles which were quite good to show the evolution of relevant issues related to digital transformation and related to participation. And those issues, there were quite a few using OpenStreetMap, so I decided to focus on OpenStreetMap as a case to analyze new issues they have encountered. Then when I looked at geospatial and citizens, there were a lot of articles, there were 65 articles, but very much oriented towards a specific application development. When I looked at the relation with democracy and with empowerment, it was much more limited. So there I decided, instead of using the publications, to go at ongoing work, or to have a look at ongoing work within the citizen science, the European Citizen Science Association. And that allowed me to make a suggestion of how the key issues have evolved and what the new key issues are today. Go and have a look at this EURISA Journal 2003. I just took the whole issue, the 2 issues, and tried to made a word cloud out of it. And then when we see what the issues are, it's very much GIS. What we find in many articles, both in the cases described in the conceptual framework, is that participation is something about local issues. There are some things about that, well, it's still new, but I think the fact that local is one of the main application areas is something to keep in mind, because it's something that has evolved quite a bit. Now, the key topics were access to geographic information. Now, a lot of the articles were about access to goods and services, access to data, which is not really what we will discuss today. But there are also a number of cases where access is viewed as a basis of wealth and power in society. And when we talk about access later on, we refer to access as a basis of wealth and power in society. Another part is the participatory approaches in using geographic information. There, again, that's what we will address, and we will look at vital issues such as equity, ownership, and control. Now, in a public participation GIS, there were several evaluations. One was that it mainly empowers community. So there is this optimistic view that this participation GIS is a perfect tool for empowerment. But there are also some negative views that say, well, this will marginalize. We are 2003, the digital divide is a very important issue still at that point. And there is a concern that those that already have an advantage and capacity to use geospatial information will just be able to become even more powerful. the ultimate goal of Participatory GIS is to help self-determination, so to have approaches, technologies, institutions that aid self-determination. So in this case, we are from simply participation. This is empowerment, self-determination. It is related to participation, but it's not exactly the same. So there are also points of view that choices may have negative as well as positive power ramifications. So there is the role of participants in creation and evaluation of data, but it also allows representation of different views, allowing to preserve contradictions. It can reflect standards and goals of the participants, allows managing and integrating different data components coming from different views, and the time component can be handled. It allows to show the history of its own development. So with this in mind, we can conclude that it is not just enabling technology, a process of where these different characteristics evolve, and communities will evolve throughout the participatory process. Now, the way this is traditionally analyzed, and I'm quite sure everybody will recognize this, from the point of view of democracy and participation, one of the most common references that is used is Arnstein's public participation ladder. It comes from an American background where basically it was used to analyze different levels of participation in housing and society for specific target groups. Now, why I chose this as reference is because it is a ladder. The ladder of participation starts with no participation, or even worse, manipulation. And then it's a ladder, so you can go up and you can come down. Somehow it implies that when you're down the ladder, you still have a way to go. And we are at the top of the ladder, you have citizen control, and that's the ultimate goal. Now, that is something to be questioned. So we will see that there is much more complexity to it than this participation ladder. We also see that there were different attitudes, and we still see that there are different attitudes, techno-optimist and techno-pessimist assumptions. One basic assumption that we find a lot in participation is that the general public wants to be more involved with decision making. And those in position of making decisions want to know what the public wants. So they will encourage the public. So that's the optimistic assumption. The pessimistic assumption is that maybe there is a lack, there is a malaise in the whole democratic process, and the willingness to become actively involved, whether it is in through geospatial technology or other technology or through other democratic processes, the willingness may be lacking. So we may question, are we supporting the right process? And one of the issues, and that's still an issue today, is that there is a malaise, there is not much interest, but on the other hand, there is also a lack of trust in policy. So maybe we need to take this, keep this in mind when we talk about what geospatial technology is enabling. And another general framework that we see a lot, that is a general framework that was used in the past and that we still encounter quite a bit, is that you have, on one side, you have policymakers, and on the other side, you have the citizen, the communities. In between, you have the facilitators. And in this case, geospatial technology is a facilitator for the communication between communities and the policymakers. And we will see that this way of very simple thinking or categorization has been challenged throughout the past years. So are the frameworks that were used in 2003. Now, I take a few cases to show the context where these were used. So we are in 2003. We see that what is GI specific? This is a case in the UK, analyzed by Robin. The key question about democracy is who takes a decision and who undergoes the consequences. So if we look at what is the geospatial dimension there, well, if everybody knows the NIMBY, not in my backyard syndrome, who takes a decision also depends on where does this person live, or what is the affinity of this person with a specific location. So the decisions may have a spatial impact, or those that undergo may be affected by the person, where the person who takes the decision comes from, or the affinity with a specific region. Another GI specific aspect is that GI is quite complex, so experts need to support the public in this participation process. And the question is, can an expert do that in a neutral way? And the answer is no. Depending on who you support, how you support the public, it will have an effect. So, but the GI specific context is that the issues, GI is very good in supporting decision-making for local issues and supporting participation on local issues. I will, what we see here is that in what context were these conclusions drawn? An analysis of 300 websites of local authorities in 2003 showed that basically most of them did not really have participation. So they either had no information access or very limited, or they were just advertising or a guide to services, but no possibility for interaction. So it's mostly providing information. It's low level, no participation. There are a few that allow for consultation. Now, there are also differences. Consultation, this is in local authorities, and it's about spatial planning issues where you had already a specific consultation process. So the consultation may be supporting existing consultation processes rather than starting new consultations. Now, I also had a quick look at the good practices there, and then we see that since 2003, most of them, disappeared or changed beyond recognition, or some were privatized. So that there is a major evolution in the participation practices. Now, one of the way it was analyzed, I will not go into in detail about this, is that it's complex. There are different aspects that can affect participation. There is the audience, there is the methods used, the issues. It's different for environmental issues, it's different for housing issues. It's also the notion, what is participation in spatial planning, where you have traditional ways of participating in decision making. It's going to be very different from other domains. But just to say that this challenges the ladder where you can say, okay, this is a case of just informing or consulting. It depends on very many different aspects, and it may affect different types of citizens and organizations in different ways. But what where there tends to be a general consensus is that citizens tend to have greater interest in local issues, that the access to information changes the relations. So the role of authority changes. Now, an overview of the findings from other cases and good practices in 2003 on participatory GIS is that governments and non-governmental institutions have an interconnected role, and that it is a process. So there is a transformation linked to it. And the transformation is not only within the participants, it is also in the mutual relations. There are also issues of different scale levels. Very often, participation is conceptualized at national scale and enacted at local scale. So and that's not always evident to have coherence among the different scale levels. Then another issue that is already addressed in 2003 and that we find in many articles later is that there is also an equity issue. If we start from the assumption that the citizens are willing to let the policymakers know what they think, then of course they will be willing to invest time and resources to participate in a PPGIS. It also implies that it's important to give them feedback to make sure that they will, that this information is used. It may also imply that some communities will not participate as much. Then we have seen cases where resources were linked to the use of PPGIS. In some cases, quota were also used to make sure that different types of, different groups of citizens were involved. But it shows that it is not straightforward to use in an equitable way participatory GIS. Then another concern is the efficiency in use in policymaking. There was a tendency to have, and we still see the effect of that today, to have different silos developed for different departments, and then the end users are asked to participate in in one department and in another department, and the information is not shared. So that is really not very efficient use of resources. And it's very important to have a good feedback so that the input is perceived as being taken into account. We also see that different cultures have an influence on how participation is done in, and we still see that today throughout Europe in citizen science projects, for example. So this allowed to make a list of strengths and weaknesses, which I will not all name, just a few. I think one of the important strengths that I would like to emphasize is that the citizens' empowerment is greater accountability to decision makers. And another one is the issue of transparency, that it's important to have, or a weakness is that very often it's not very clear how the information from the is used in the decision making. But there is definitely the citizens, both politicians and citizens can become more accountable for the decisions. So these are the issues 2003 and a little later. So now I will show some more recent case studies and new issues that we discovered. One of the issues that we found very little about in earlier days, but today it's quite important, is liability and data quality. There is a reluctance in many public administrations to, once you provide your data, you make them open and you let the citizens use them and work with them. Who is reliable? Whose quality? What is the quality of these data, and how reliable are the data, and who is responsible for the quality of the data? One of the good practices that I found is an example. The map that you see here is the open cycle map in the Netherlands, where the Cycling Federation has volunteers that get training and map all the cycling tracks and the nodes in the entire country. Now, in this case, the data are compared and they are quite consistent with the data from the Public Works Department. But what happens, or a way of dealing with it, is to red flag some areas. If many citizens, many users identify problems in a certain area, it can help to focus on that area to see what is going on with the data, what is the reason why there are inconsistencies. So identify locations of concern. Another good practice in terms of liability and data quality is to use crowdsourcing for enriching data and testing mapping decisions and tools. Here I have an example. It's one of our projects where the Public Administration of Flanders developed a green map. Now, the validation of the green map in the field for public space, it's quite easy, but it becomes much more difficult for gardens. And one of the problems that they encountered was the identification of what is a garden. Why is it so important? Well, we produce statistics on ecosystems, on different aspects of gardening, permeability, and so on. And the idea is to collect this through citizen science and by asking the public. Now, if the people have a different perception of what is a garden, and then they give the information, we will end up having double counts in statistics of a pasture with 2 or 3 sheep or horses on it that are considered a garden by the citizen and are not considered a garden by the public administration. So the definition of what is a garden, there were different options, models used to delineate the gardens that was validated before starting the public participation. Another example on liability and data quality is to try and have as many as possible participants. Here in this case, we have a very easy method to measure air quality by citizen. Now, how we need because it's particularly on fine particles, which are very locally, very much. So the citizens were involved in measuring, and I selected this as a good practice because these are data that are very hard to get any other way. Now, what it requires is very clear guidelines. And even with clear guidelines, there are still inconsistencies. It's also, in this case, it got a lot of news attention and participants did get feedback on the effect that these measures had. I don't know if you see here the city of Antwerp. This was one of the main arguments to modify major road infrastructure works, construction of the ring road in Antwerp. So the link, it was not just give feedback to the participants, but it was also clearly used to inform policymakers. So it was used clearly in the public debate and in the political debate. Another issue that we find quite often is that we ask the citizen quite a bit. So there tends to be fatigue, and if we want people to participate, we need to stimulate and motivate them. And one of the important issues here that I want to emphasize is that we talk about the skills, and we talk about the skills of adults when we think of citizens, but we have now in Erasmus+, there are a number of projects where we help teachers, because there is at this moment a big change in our education system of primary and secondary school about science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, which implies that schools all over Europe are looking for ways to better teach these, because there is a shortage on the marketplace, and the teachers are really in need of good material to bring to their pupils. But that's another way of getting participation. And another one, aside from the link with school education, is to link with events. One of the well-known examples is the crisis in Nepal, where there was a major map exercise. So humanitarian participation for humanitarian aid is really a good example. And what is also important there is that, okay, it is humanitarian aid, but it allows the citizen to contribute even before policy intervention. So not bypassing, but it is participation not to policy, but participation in aid in this case. So it's very direct. And another reason why this, I think, is a good example is because the intermediaries are replaced by self-organized end users. OpenStreetMap has a very elaborate system of new users, also having real expert users make sure that the data quality is okay and that can coach new users. So the skills of the end users are very important. Another example where events were used, I like to take to show that it's not as value-free as one might think. So here, in this case, we have a collection of historical photographs that are that have been enriched through artificial intelligence to add an exact date and to identify who was there and where the pictures were taken. And then there was a citizen involved through the commemoration of the end of the war to about these images. And a toolset was developed for that, but the toolset didn't work unless it was used by in combination with some commemoration. Another way of stimulating is that is to bring in challenges and gamification. Here is the example of the best nature photography of the Audubon Society. The same happened. There are also events and games and awards in the commemoration application. But one side remark about the development of these technologies of these technologies to support and stimulate participation is that it seems value-free, but by the way it is, for example, which events are there and how are awards given, it is not entirely value-free. So there is a bias. And what is important is that there is even evidence that the use of an ontology is not value-free. So in this case, the way some buildings or some events are referred to do reflect some values. So it's important to make sure that that we acknowledge that. Now, another reason why this project, iMedia Cities, is taken is that it developed an ontology to make different films and all documentaries to the public. Now, very often there are issues of privacy and most part of these old films can be open to the public, but some frames are sensitive, and at this point there is a tendency to leave out the entire film then. So what here is a question for research to use, usually for research purposes they can be used. So to use research and make sure that whatever is privacy sensitive is left out, but that the rest is documented and is made available as much as possible. And another case where geospatial technology was used to make some public data available and then enrich them through public participation is a project, Horizon 2020 project called Polyvisu, where the idea was to calculate black zones and then produce a map of black zones instead of a map of accident points, accident locations, because those cannot be published as they can be identified and they are private, it's private information. And similar to some data from the automatic license plate cameras about traffic density were anonymized and were aggregated and allowed to make some maps showing where there is a lot of traffic and showing where there are a lot of accidents, just using hotspots. Now, these maps were then published as open data, and then they were used to develop apps for schools, making school transport plans, and for students who are wanting to cycle in order to make safe routes to school. And then there is the possibility to give feedback. So now we have the public data that have been made available, and we use them to generate new hard-to-get information, because in the case of accidents, the best prevention is not wait for accidents to happen. And if we give even children the power to mention close accidents or where the situation is perceived as unsafe, we really empower them, and we get extremely hard to get information for public administration action. Then another example is the new tools to support co-creation and access to information. There I would like to mention the Time Machine, which is a project on big data of the past, where tools have been made to make 3D visualizations of cities and link all different types of data through very elaborate autonomy and through tools for enriching the data and the metadata. Now, this is a good practice, but at the same time, it also shows a threat, because the project was very successful, but it was originally intended as the time machine for Europe, but it turned out to be extremely expensive to manage all these events. So now they switched to local time machines. And a risk that we find here is that not that to work with local time machines and to focus on the local level, but that the main reason is that it's so expensive and hard to manage. So we risk having a Matthew effect. Now, for those who are not familiar with the Matthew effect, it means that those that already have a lot and are empowered will get more, and those that start in a weaker position, they will also get more, but the discrepancy between both will grow. And there is some, when we look at what are the cities where these geospatial technologies and tools are used, we do see that there is a tendency to have the usual suspects coming back, and the same regions getting and cities getting most benefit of it. Another threat that we found is well documented in OpenStreetMap. Everything dealing with vandalism and bad edits. I'm not just talking about bad quality due to lack of links, but sometimes when it's vandalism, the main reason is just for fun. But there are also cases of edit wars, where things are changed constantly, or disputes, spamming. So there are a lot of risks involved in editing, letting the public edit, and sometimes it's on purpose. So I think it's important for public authorities, because it means basically the public authorities are also contributing. So the citizens are self-organized and they become experts, but there is a role for the public authorities to protect these communities and to help them fight potential manipulation and infiltration. In OpenStreetMap, the community itself has a response. They have preventive measures. The guidelines are adapted when they see when they can figure out reasons why there are bad edits. If there is, for example, vandalism, it will be reverted, and there can be sanctions. But all this does take valuable resources that could be better used, but that are needed to protect the participation by the citizens. Then there are also questions about the viability and the usefulness for participatory democracy. And this is a very recent publication where the conclusion is that there is still a problem of literacy skills. It's not so much anymore the digital device, but it's more the map literacy skills. So yes, there is a need to identify properly what are the skills required in order to help the participation. And we do see that there is also still a lack of trust among planners and decision makers about data quality. So this needs to be addressed as well. It can be questioned if participation automatically contributes to more sustainable planning decisions. Now that's participation in general, but it is still a problem when we use geospatial technology to support it. And in many ways, there is still this question of, is it a two-way communication between planners and the public? So to summarize the main messages, in the strengths, we do see that what started as very local initiatives, now we have really worldwide participatory GIS. Think of the humanitarian aid in OpenStreetMap. The geospatial skills definitely have improved, and the social acceptance also changed, and the participation in itself has changed the actor position. So through the participation, the skills improve, and through improved skills, the participation improves. The weaknesses is that there are issues of security and vulnerability that should be handled. And we do see that there are still cultural differences. And so think of the Matthew effect. These cultural differences are reflected by the fact that some cultures are more, will benefit more from this geospatial technology in the participation than others. Then there are opportunities. Of course, we need to follow the further developments. There are inspiring examples of planners and decision makers really relying on data generated by the public. So there are possibilities to learn from these good practices. Now, threats, the relative positions of power in respect to different stakeholder groups within the decision-making process remain or even exacerbated. And there are still a number of uncertainties which should be addressed either through research. Now we look at geospatial technology supporting participatory process, but the link with sustainable planning decisions and political decisions should also be considered, because it's something that is not necessarily a one-on-one relation. And this question of two-way communication, how can we better facilitate this, is also an issue to be addressed. So from there are the main conclusions that we find. Consider today's key issues. It is not so much GIS and local. It is more empowerment. It is acknowledging the process also in skill development and the participatory process, which are mutually related. And it's not just empowerment, it's also going through co-creation. And the recommendations is to acknowledge that there are still some weaknesses, so that there can be implicit discrimination, and that it's not because it's a technological improvement that it is value-free. Empowerment starts with skills, education, and awareness raising. And the government is no longer it's no longer just on one side and then informing or listening to the communities. The communities are increasingly self-organized. So it's no longer just participation, it is co-creation. And even if we think in a dynamic way, it's co-evolution, because all those who participate, including the government, will evolve through the process. So also there is a need to further research equity. There, I think the artificial intelligence and the massive use of big data from varied sources should be looked at, because this may have an opposite effect to the participatory cases that we have been looking at. So to conclude, what are the future directions? There has been an evolution, but it needs to be further regarded from very simple bidirectional top-down, bottom-up, and bipolar policy citizen communities to a very much more complex, and in this case it's circular, but even the circular approach has been questioned, but much more complex relations and much more dynamic processes in the public participation through geospatial technology. This framework has been used to analyze citizen science projects in Europe, and the results will be published soon. So to start the discussion, I just have 3 open questions, but I hope we will have more. What challenges do public authorities face for participatory activities using geospatial technologies thinking? I would like to know your opinion about that in a co-creative way. And are there any other examples that you think others could find interesting? Are there other issues or aspects we did not touch upon and that need to be addressed? And then I will pass the floor to Robin again to lead the discussion.
So, first of all, thanks so much, Therese. There's a few things I have to give my appreciation on in the first instance. First, everybody needs to know rapid studies called rapid studies, because in the project I give you so little time to really address the issues, and you have covered so many topics from the past and present that are important to us. And beyond that, I should emphasize that any interpretation here is also Therese's personal opinion. Nothing here, let's say, formally is a position of the European Commission, but there are so many things that public administrations would need to take on board from what you're saying that I think is definitely worthy of further debate. Within that context, I also believe it's really important to see where we've come from, because there are some messages from the past, things that are changing that we need to pay attention to. And from that point of view, at least from where I come from, I think it's really important to have your academic perspective in here and to be able to ground some of our ideas in the frameworks that we've seen in the past and how those have evolved. I think it's really important in general in the context of sharing geospatial data, understanding how public administrations could change and the interactions with citizens, that we actually have some of the grounding, because otherwise we might be theorizing or putting things into practice, floating up there and not really touching upon the things that matter. So by able to explore some of this, and it's only, let's say, no more than 2 weeks of work off and on that Therese has done this, it's helping to break new ground, I think, for other people to consider. So I really appreciate also the pointers that you've put in place. And from that point of view, I'd like to also underline that this rapid study is really the first attempt that we're aware of into looking at the evolution of this topic and trying to bring together approaches to do with citizens and geospatial, where we of course have seen the emerging issues since the work in Spoleto that you kindly reviewed, have seen, say, the emergence of volunteer geographic information and of course citizen science, where there's been a lot of efforts there in terms of organisations, networks, comments in the chat, of course, around that. But we also see, as you showed from the work from the Association of GI Laboratories in Europe, Agile, that a much focus has been around technology and potentially spatial data infrastructures, but there are related areas that we have to take into account. Very briefly, I would say, for me, the geospatial community in both the research and in practice has a lot to offer to the transformation, and issues also very much close to interoperability, such as the ontologies topic that you mentioned in data sharing. The things are value born here, and we have to pay attention to that. Who is creating such things and what do they mean by them? But I think more work needs to be done here, and perhaps we're beginning to uncover and manage some of the complexity that you highlighted at the beginning. Just one thought on that. Certainly, for me, social organizational and social technical issues are important in our understanding. And in terms of exploring, let's say, in practice, issues that I referred to at the beginning, such as networking, collaboration, and participation, that are close to the notions of digital transformation. And I think collective understanding that we could develop here may better help us to manage some of these activities and networks in the digital transformation of government, related ecosystems that are emerging between governments, businesses and citizens. And of course, you gave the example of a sustainable planning approach, but there are many application areas that in government that this may relate to. Next slide, please. So just to quickly say, this will essentially close the session, but studies on this one, if you have any thoughts and feedback to share with us, as Therese mentioned, we have 2 projects of the project that we're trying to fill some of the gaps and issues we've raised. One is a little reference material book, etc., called the Geospatial Primer, and the other one is a workshop pack that allowed people to discuss some of these ideas in practice with colleagues from different organizations and even potentially between public administrations and citizens or businesses. I want to highlight that this particular presentation is now the fourth in the series, where we've previously, as we introduced, talked about the digital government transformation topics in general, but also a couple of two here technical topics on application programming interfaces and persistent identifiers. And to highlight, probably we're just going to confirm this soon, but look out for the announcement on the 26th of September, coming in again here to look specifically at the role of spatial data infrastructures in the digital transformation of public administrations, building on my colleague Vanda, again with the team from Catholic University Leuven. It's our opportunity as well through this meeting to ask you, do you have any other topics, having heard the presentation today, and have a look, of course, at the ones we have online here from the previous studies that you would like us to address, that, let's say, in the round helps us to answer the question, what is the role of spatial in the digital transformation of government? So, again, in closing, thanks to all of you who have participated, and for the time left, I think we could at least discuss some of the open issues or any other questions that you have in the chat that Therese has introduced, and we could, of course, be happy to take anything else on board. So I will thank you all now and stop the recording, and for the 15 so minutes we have left, we can have some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.